January 1941. Newport News, Virginia. Before sunrise, the shipyard is already awake. Steel plates lie stacked like city blocks. Cranes hover motionless in the cold air, waiting. Welders strike arcs of white light that briefly turn night into day. Along the slipways, the unfinished hulls of aircraft carriers stretch toward the water, long, blunt silhouettes, quiet but enormous. These ships are not yet named. They do not carry aircraft, but their timelines are already fixed. Each week is measured, each launch date calculated. The work does not pause for diplomacy or distance. It moves forward by schedule alone. Across the Pacific, in Tokyo, naval officers study different numbers: fuel reserves, pilot training hours, hull counts that cannot be replaced once lost. They know what American factories can do when fully unleashed. They have read the reports. They have seen the projections. The threat is not a fleet at sea. It is a calendar. Because once these carriers touch the water, once they begin arriving not in ones or twos but in waves, the balance of the Pacific will no longer be decided by tactics or courage, but by output. And Japan knows it is running out of time. In the years after the First World War, the world's great navies tried to freeze time. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 was not an agreement born of trust, but of exhaustion. Battleships had grown too large, too expensive, too politically dangerous to keep building without restraint. The treaty imposed tonnage limits, ratios, and ceilings: 5 for the United States, 5 for Britain, 3 for Japan. On paper, it looked like balance. In reality, it was a pause. Japan accepted those limits with visible reluctance. Its leadership understood geography in ways continental powers did not. Japan was an island nation with no strategic depth. Every drop of oil, every ton of steel, every aircraft engine had to arrive by sea. Naval strength was not a policy choice. It was survival. The treaty's ratios were interpreted in Tokyo not as compromise, but as containment. Yet within the treaty's constraints, something new was taking shape. Aircraft carriers, initially treated as auxiliaries to the battleship, began to reveal a different future. The conversion of battlecruiser hulls into carriers like Akagi and Kaga was not innovation born of freedom, but of limitation. Japan, lacking the industrial mass of the United States, leaned into quality, range, and pilot excellence. Long-range strike capability became doctrine. Precision would substitute for numbers. The United States, by contrast, had time. American naval planners observed carrier aviation with interest rather than urgency. The U.S. Navy experimented. It ran fleet problems in the Pacific. It tested doctrine slowly, methodically. Where Japan refined elite air groups, the United States refined systems: maintenance, logistics, deck handling, rotation of crews. The difference was subtle, but it mattered. By the mid-1930s, the treaty system began to crack. Japan withdrew from the naval agreements in 1936, openly rejecting limits it believed were designed to hold it down. The move was not reckless. It was calculated. Japanese planners believed war with the United States, if it came, would be decided quickly, before American industry could fully mobilize. This belief shaped everything that followed. Japan's carrier force in the late 1930s was formidable. Its pilots were among the best trained in the world, many with combat experience from China. Its carriers emphasized offensive reach, capable of striking farther than any fleet afloat. But behind the polished decks and disciplined formations lay fragility. Pilot training took years. Aircraft production was limited. Replacement pipelines were thin. American weaknesses, meanwhile, appeared obvious. The U.S. Navy in 1939 was still spread between oceans. Isolationism dominated public opinion. Congress debated budgets slowly. Shipbuilding appeared deliberate, even sluggish. But beneath the surface, foundations were being laid. American naval planners did not expect a short war. They expected a long one. War Plan Orange, the contingency plan for conflict with Japan, assumed early losses, followed by industrial recovery, followed by overwhelming force. It was not elegant. It was patient. It assumed that time, once engaged, would favor the United States. The critical difference was not doctrine at sea. It was philosophy ashore. Japan planned for a decisive battle. The United States planned for production. As the 1930s closed, the question was no longer whether aircraft carriers would dominate naval warfare. That debate had been settled by exercises and observation. The question was who could build them faster, repair them quicker, crew them continuously, and replace what was lost without hesitation. Japan believed it could strike hard enough, early enough, to make those questions irrelevant. But as Europe descended into war in 1939, and as American factories began shifting quietly toward preparedness, a different reality started to take shape. One measured not in fleets, but in schedules, contracts, and steel. And slowly, almost invisibly, production timelines began to overtake strategy. The change did not arrive with speeches or declarations. It arrived with paperwork. In July 1940, as France collapsed and Britain stood alone, the United States Congress passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act. On paper, it was a budget authorization. In practice, it was a decision to outbuild every potential enemy combined. The act called for a massive expansion of the U.S. Navy, new battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and, most critically, aircraft carriers. This was not improvisation. It was mobilization. American shipyards, long accustomed to commercial work and steady naval contracts, were reorganized for scale. Designs were standardized. Processes were simplified. The Navy did not seek perfection in each hull. It sought reliability and repeatability. The Essex-class aircraft carrier became the centerpiece of this philosophy, large enough to carry powerful air groups, simple enough to build again and again. Where earlier carriers had been treated as unique ships, Essex-class hulls were treated as units in a system. Construction timelines were compressed. Components were prefabricated. Multiple yards built identical sections simultaneously. Launch dates were planned before keels were laid. The goal was not a single decisive fleet, it was continuity. A carrier damaged in battle would be replaced by another already halfway down a slipway. This approach extended beyond steel. Pilot training expanded on an industrial scale. Flight schools multiplied across the American heartland. Training hours were standardized. Carrier landing techniques were drilled repeatedly, not to create aces, but to create consistency. Losses, when they came, would be absorbed. Japan watched these developments with growing alarm. Japanese naval intelligence understood the numbers. They saw projected hull counts. They tracked construction schedules. They knew that once the United States committed fully, parity would evaporate. Even before Pearl Harbor, Japanese planners estimated that by 1944 or 1945, American carrier strength would be overwhelming. That projection became a countdown. Fuel posed another imbalance. The United States sat atop vast oil reserves and refining capacity. Japan depended on imports, increasingly vulnerable to embargo and interdiction. Every carrier sortie consumed irreplaceable resources. American planners, by contrast, assumed abundance. Repair capability widened the gap further. U.S. carriers were designed with damage control in mind, firefighting systems, compartmentalization, and repair doctrine. Crews trained to save ships, not abandon them. A carrier hit, but not sunk, could return to service within months. Japanese carriers were lethal, but fragile. Their doctrine emphasized offense over survivability. Fire spread quickly. Damage often meant permanent loss. By late 1941, the imbalance was no longer theoretical. It was structural. The United States had not yet fired a shot, but its shipyards were already at war. Cranes moved day and night. Launch ceremonies followed one another in quick succession. Each new hull reduced the strategic value of Japanese superiority at the start of the conflict. Japan's leadership understood this. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Japan's carrier doctrine, was among the clearest voices warning that war against the United States could only be won quickly or not at all. He did not fear American sailors. He feared American factories. Pearl Harbor, when it came, was not an act of confidence. It was an act of urgency. Because once American carrier production reached full stride, Japan would no longer be choosing how to fight. It would be reacting, forced to gamble everything on early blows before the industrial tide could rise. And with the ink still drying on construction contracts across the United States, that tide was already on the move. The pressure now shifted from planning rooms to decision-making, where human judgment, doctrine, and fear would collide with the reality of numbers. Behind the statistics and shipyard schedules were men who understood exactly what those numbers meant. In Tokyo, senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. By 1944, the momentum of American aircraft carrier production had transformed the Pacific into a theater dominated not only by fleets, but by numbers. Shipyards from the East Coast to the West were no longer quietly building vessels. They were shaping the very course of the war. Essex-class carriers, launched in waves, represented more than naval assets. They were the embodiment of industrial inevitability. Each hull entering the water erased a fraction of Japan's strategic options. The question was no longer how battles would be fought, but how long Japan could survive the weight of production. The Philippine Sea in June 1944 offered the first brutal illustration. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as it came to be called, was more than an aerial engagement. It was a numerical indictment. Japanese aircraft, flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots, met a fleet of American carriers staffed by fresh crews, equipped with new aircraft, and supported by perfected radar and fleet coordination. Losses were catastrophic. Hundreds of planes were destroyed, many before reaching their targets. Carrier decks and flight operations had become a machine, producing relentless pressure that Japan could not counter. At the tactical level, Japanese admirals continued to fight with skill and audacity. The Shokaku and Zuikaku groups executed strikes with precision. Their crews flew daring maneuvers, executing complex formations in the face of overwhelming opposition. Yet the results were always diminished. Every carrier sunk, every plane lost, was irreplaceable. Each victory came at a cost that the Americans could absorb effortlessly. From the American perspective, the outcome of engagements was almost predetermined. Even when early errors or misjudgments occurred, the system corrected itself. Damaged carriers returned to service. Replacement pilots were already trained and ready. Each lost aircraft was replaced by one mass-produced and standardized, ready for combat. The relentless flow of production meant that the industrial tide dictated the tempo of the war. Japan's strategic thinking grew increasingly desperate. Battles were no longer calculated opportunities to seize initiative, but reactive attempts to delay the inevitable. Yamamoto's warnings, once theoretical, had become tangible realities. The Imperial Navy could win tactically, but losing strategically had become unavoidable. Production had become destiny, and Japan was on the losing side of that equation. By late 1944, every Japanese decision was shadowed by the knowledge of American output. Major operations, from the Marianas to the Philippines, were planned against an enemy whose growing fleet could be counted in weeks rather than months. Attrition could no longer be leveraged to shift balance. It simply accelerated Japan's decline. Strategic options were shrinking with each new carrier, each new trained aircrew, each new hull launched from a U.S. slipway. This industrial momentum also had psychological effects. Japanese commanders recognized the futility of repeated strikes, yet continued to press forward, trapped by doctrine, honor, and desperation. American officers, by contrast, grew more confident, aware that their losses were temporary and their victories cumulative. Production had created not just material superiority, but moral advantage. In the end, the turning point was not marked by a single explosive event, but by an unrelenting, silent accumulation of capability. Every American carrier launched, every pilot trained, every ship repaired, was a step toward an inevitable conclusion. By mid-1944, Japan was no longer in control of the war's tempo. The battlefields were set, but the clock and the factories were running against them. And as the Pacific stretched from the Marianas to the Philippines, Japan was forced into reaction. Desperate offensives, calculated gambles, and heroic sacrifices could not reverse what had already been determined in steel and time. America's production was no longer behind the scenes. It had become the main actor, writing the final chapters of Japan's naval struggle, even before a single shot had been fired. By 1945, the outcome of the Pacific War had been largely written, not in battle reports, not in heroic charges or daring raids, but in the steady rhythm of American shipyards. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once feared for its precision, reach, and audacity, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Carriers sunk at Midway, the Solomon Islands, and the Philippine Sea were never replaced at the same pace. Hulls remained on slipways in Japan, raw steel, and timber unable to match the flood of Essex-class carriers arriving in the Pacific. The consequences were stark. Japan lost nearly all of its fleet carriers and most of its experienced pilots. By mid-1945, only a handful of operational carriers remained, and even they were incapable of challenging the American Navy's overwhelming numbers. Entire air groups, trained over years in rigorous programs, were annihilated. Replacement pilots, hurriedly trained, could not replicate the skill and cohesion of their predecessors. The United States, in contrast, entered 1945 with fleets that could be deployed in multiple theaters simultaneously. Damage sustained in battles was temporary. Repairs, modernizations, and replacements ensured that operational strength was never diminished for long. Carrier aviation, once a nascent concept, had become the backbone of American naval strategy. The system had proven itself not through isolated brilliance, but through continuity, endurance, and scale. Numbers alone dictated the strategic landscape. Japanese attempts to mount counteroffensives were measured not against American courage or tactics, but against industrial math. Every operation was doomed to fail unless it could produce immediate, overwhelming results, an impossibility given the United States' capacity to recover losses quickly and deploy new forces without interruption. Reports from the field underscored the imbalance. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American intelligence noted Japanese losses in pilots and aircraft that would take years, if ever, to replace. Every record confirmed what Tokyo's planners had feared. The war was no longer winnable by tactical skill alone. Strategic attrition had shifted decisively in favor of American production. Japan's naval power, formidable in 1941, had become a cautionary relic. The material consequences extended beyond carriers and planes. Fuel shortages crippled operations. Shipyard bottlenecks prevented repairs and replacements. Even the most audacious plans, such as kamikaze attacks in the final months, were reactions to a reality shaped by production rather than strategy. The United States industrial system had become both sword and shield. It supplied weapons while denying them to the enemy. Japan's naval collapse was not immediate, but inevitable. By mid-1945, American carrier strength enabled operations across the entire Pacific, from Okinawa to Iwo Jima, unchallenged by any comparable Japanese threat. What began as a race of numbers and schedules had determined the war's trajectory with clinical precision. The defeat of Japan's carrier fleet and the collapse of its naval aviation had effects that went beyond the material. Morale, strategy, and national psychology were reshaped by the recognition of an enemy whose strength was measured not in skill alone, but in relentless output. Japanese commanders faced a profound reckoning. Years of meticulous planning, the cultivation of elite pilots, and the execution of daring operations could not compensate for the overwhelming capacity of American industry. Battles that had once been fought with precision and audacity now felt like exercises in delay. Every tactical victory was hollow because the underlying imbalance could not be corrected. The psychological weight of knowing that the enemy could absorb losses, replace ships, and train new crews faster than Japan could fight had a chilling effect on decision-making. Fear, caution, and urgency replaced confidence. Across the Pacific, the United States experienced a contrasting effect. Sailors and pilots recognized that losses, while painful, did not compromise the larger strategy. Confidence in industrial output transformed into operational boldness. Commanders could plan multi-carrier operations, launch simultaneous offensives, and rotate forces without hesitation. Production itself became a strategic weapon, reinforcing morale and providing a tangible sense of momentum that no single engagement could disrupt. The global implications were equally profound. The Pacific War demonstrated a fundamental shift in modern warfare. Industrial capacity had become a decisive factor, capable of determining outcomes as much as tactical skill or battlefield ingenuity. Nations with insufficient production, regardless of bravery or technological innovation, faced strategic vulnerability. Japan's experience served as a stark lesson in the limits of elite skill without scalable support. For future generations, this era redefined the logic of naval planning. Aircraft carriers were no longer symbols of individual prowess or singular victories. They were instruments of sustained pressure, whose effectiveness relied on the ability to replace, repair, and replenish continuously. Industrial logistics emerged as a form of strategic weaponry, inseparable from the fleet itself. By the war's end, Japan's surrender was not only a military outcome. It was the acknowledgement that industrial momentum had dictated the conflict. The psychological impact lingered long after the final carrier was sunk. Strategy, once considered the province of admirals and pilots, had become inseparable from factories, shipyards, and assembly lines. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted, irrevocably, in favor of those who could sustain it. The story of America's aircraft carrier production was, in the end, a story of inevitability. It reshaped minds, influenced decisions, and demonstrated that in modern warfare, the race of industry can determine destiny just as decisively as courage, skill, or ambition. The Pacific War teaches a lesson that goes beyond fleets, battles, or heroic deeds. It shows that modern warfare is measured as much in factories and shipyards as in skill and courage. America's relentless aircraft carrier production created a reality that Japan could not counter, no matter the brilliance of its admirals or the prowess of its pilots. The tide of steel and manpower was unstoppable, a quiet, inexorable force that reshaped the balance of power across thousands of miles of ocean. Aircraft carriers, once symbols of naval experimentation, became instruments of strategic inevitability. Each hull launched, each pilot trained, each plane repaired, contributed to an accumulation of power that no single victory could reverse. Japan fought valiantly, relying on skill, audacity, and precision, yet these qualities could not overcome a system designed for endurance. The war was decided not by one bold maneuver, but by a cumulative, industrial momentum that defined what was possible and what was not. This dynamic offers a broader reflection on human endeavor and technology. Conflict is no longer simply a contest of bravery. It is a contest of resources, organization, and foresight. The combination of vision, discipline, and industrial capacity can create outcomes that appear inevitable in hindsight. For Japan, the lesson was bitter. Even the most talented forces are vulnerable when the opponent's production machine outpaces them relentlessly. In the calm aftermath, the Pacific stretched vast and empty, dotted with the remnants of carriers and planes that once symbolized might. The factories in America continued to hum, not merely as engines of war, but as proof that sustained effort and systematic planning can determine the course of history. The human drama, the pilots, the admirals, the sailors, remains vivid in memory, yet it is inseparable from the silent, unstoppable rhythm of production that ultimately shaped victory and defeat. Time and steel, patience and precision, had triumphed. And in that truth lies the enduring lesson of the Pacific War. In modern conflict, the future is often forged long before the first shot is fired.